Okay, this video is about the bottom end rebuild, my son's cr125 2000. Right now it's rebuilt, it's done, but the video you're about to watch is the rebuild process. I have a video on the teardown already, and there's a video on the clutch, and there's a video on the top end, so that won't be in this series of videos. I think I'm breaking this down in 2 or 3 videos for the sake of time. Many hours went into this rebuild, lots of little videos here and there, so I had to combine everything and did some quick editing. It's summertime and haven't had a lot of time to sit down and do the editing, so hopefully it's halfway decent for you. If you're using this to help you rebuild your motor, definitely do that. But I do want to put a disclaimer out there. This is, my backyard project. I've been working on dirt bikes and quads and cars my whole life, but I am not a professional motorcycle mechanic by any means, but I do have a lot of experience. But this is my journey into the bottom end. Definitely use it for reference and to help you out with yours. But I definitely recommend that you get the either OEM book from Honda, or get the Climber book, which I used, and I find the Climber book to be the best when you're doing these kind of projects. So this is the guide that I used. Again, it's the Climber M464. You can't do it without a book. Again, if you're diving into this project and maybe your first time or your second time into the bottom end of a motor, definitely you have to have this. I reference this constantly. There's other videos out there on YouTube too that may help you also. And again, if mine helps you out, that's kind of the point of me making it. But this is just, again, it's my journey. I'm not saying I did everything perfectly, but it did come out good. We've been riding it for about 4 days now, and haven't had any issues. It's running nice and smooth, and yeah, so everything's pretty good. But anyhow, I want to keep this video as short as possible. Hope you enjoy. Okay, our crankshaft came in today, so we're going to get this opened up and take a look. Alright, we're going to go ahead and remove this bearing. That's the end. We're going to be pushing it out this way. Got a 24mm socket. That's going to line up pretty good. And we're going to take our ball peen and we're going to give this a few smacks, and hopefully it pops right out. Okay, there's our new crank, our 2 new bearings, and a full gasket kit. Okay, next we're going to bang out the next bearing. And as I was saying before, pay attention to the orientation. If you can see that, this side has the writing on it. So your new bearing will probably be the same, probably one side with writing, one side without. So just make sure you put it back in that way. This opening is a little bit smaller, so I'm going to use a 21mm socket. Basically, whatever socket you have, that'll fit in there. And you don't want it to be tight either, because you don't want to do any damage to the casing. And one of these bearings definitely took on some damage. If you watch the earlier videos, I explained what happened, that the bike locked up, the rear tire locked up. It was like a real sudden lockup, basically, for lack of a better term. So I had a feeling we would have issue with these bearings, but this one here, is spinning. Doesn't really feel smooth. but this one here, if I hold the inner race, I can't even spin it. If I grab a hold of it good, you know, I can get it to move, but it's all crunchy, definitely locked up. Alright, before we go any further, I'm going to get these cleaned up a bit, get all the grease and dirt and any other chunks of junk that's in there out before we start installing new bearings and such. I use this Purple Power stuff. It's pretty cheap. I think I get it at Advanced Auto. I think 2 of these was like $6 maybe. But so anyhow, I'm going to go do that now. I'm going to get this cleaned up, and I'll be back. Okay, we got the one bearing dropped in already. My video camera decided to not record for whatever reason, but basically we heated up the case in our stove. I put it on 350 for a little bit over a half an hour, maybe like 35 minutes. And then the bearing's been in the freezer since last night, so that's actually been in there almost 24 hours. You don't necessarily need to have it in there for 24 hours. I would say, to be safe, I would say 7 or 8 hours. But basically, the bearing didn't quite drop in all the way. I had to help it a little bit with my ball peen hammer, very carefully. You know, you don't want to force it in, and you definitely don't want to mar up the bearing. But with a couple small, careful taps, it dropped right in. Bearing is fresh out of the freezer. We're going to go out and get the case out of the stove. Make sure you wear gloves, obviously, when you take that out of the stove. I mean, I think that goes without saying, but even a pair of gloves like this really isn't enough, so I got a couple oven mitts. Letters facing out. Okay, we're going to start our reassembly now. We're going to start by doing our seals first, get them in, and then we can start putting our gears and shift works back in. We're going to go ahead and take our seals. We're going to use a little bit of this Mobil 1 synthetic grease and pack the inside of the seal a little bit before we put that in. Again, use your book, and I don't think this came with any paperwork, but make sure you're putting your seals in the right way, obviously. They usually go with this, I'll call it inner lip, that you're going to pack with grease. That usually goes down, but definitely, hopefully you remember how the old ones came out, or you took pictures, and with the help of your book, it shouldn't be an issue figuring that out. Try to find a clean socket that is close to the diameter of the seal. You know, it could be a little bit smaller, but make sure it's not too small, because these seals usually have metal in them. It's usually, you know, beneath the rubber. Sometimes you can see it, but I put seals in before on swing arms and things like that, and if you're not putting this in straight, you can actually bend it, and then you don't get a good seal, and you end up having to order a new one. So just push it in the best you can with your fingers, and then get your socket that'll match up with the diameter, and that should tap right in. Okay, we're getting set up here to drop the crankshaft in. That's in the freezer. It's been in there all night, so it should be ready to go. Hopefully we get that lined up, and hopefully it falls right into place. Okay, so this is the right crankcase side, so we're going to be putting the splined end down. That should be it. If you have a rubber mallet, you might want to just tap it a little bit carefully. I don't know where mine is, so that'll do the trick. And you'll notice, obviously, coming out of the freezer, you got some ice buildup on here, condensation. So make sure once that thaws out, you spray it down with some WD-40. I don't have any with me. I got PB Blaster. I rather do WD-40, but I'm just going to take some of this, spray it on a rag, and wipe it on there. That way we won't have any problems with it getting any corrosion or anything like that. I just want to mention, again, I know I mentioned this earlier in some of the videos, but when you're taking the motor apart, definitely be very careful. Keep an eye on your washers, where they came from. They stick to things. They're easy to drop. I was very careful, so I'm 98% sure I didn't lose any washers. But when I was going through the sequence of everything, whoever was in this motor the last time, and I could tell whoever did it wasn't a professional by any means, and I'm missing 1, 2, 3 thrust washers, one of these spacer washers. That's just a new washer for the clutch. I needed a new one of those. They get beat up when you take them off. And also the woodruff for the shaft. So that's all the stuff that was missing, believe it or not. And you might think, geez, how was this motor even running? But it ran. But the problem being, when you don't have these thrust washers in the right place, you have play side to side. You're going to have more friction and things like that. So, and the worst thing was, time I gathered all these parts up, I lost a week and a half on putting this motor back together. So just be careful, and just because you kept a good eye on it, don't assume that whoever was in the motor before kept an eye on things, and just make sure everything's there. Okay, I'm going to try to go through these gears for the sake of somebody that's using this video to help them with their rebuild. For me at least, and I'm assuming other people, this is one of the most technical parts as far as putting it back together, making sure everything's correct, because there's a lot of washers, thrust washers, there's snap rings, and some of the gears are flat on one side, I'll call it, and the other side has a ridge on it. So if you were watching the video earlier, as you take your two cases apart, when you split your cases, it's very easy for these gears to stick to one side, pieces fall out. So you got to make sure everything's dead on when you put these back together. So get yourself a schematic. You can go online, you can go to any like Honda OEM, like Babbitt's or something like that, and go in underneath the parts for your year, make, and model, and should be able to get an exploded view, and that'll help you, and also should be able to find a lot of information in your book as well. So this right here, they're calling the main shaft. So if you look at this here, this gear right here, this small gear, is this guy right here, and he's permanent. He's part of the shaft, so that's right. There's nothing, no snap ring or anything, but again, that's part of the shaft, so that's always going to be there. So we're going to follow this. You have that there. Next, you're going to have this gear, which is this guy here, which is in place. Then you're going to have a spacer. Might be hard to see, but it's in there, and yeah, it's right below my thumb if you can see that. And I know that's in there because I never took these snap rings off, so I never took that section apart. So after the spacer, which is number 16 we're looking at, then you have number 24, which I'm just going to call it a washer for now. That's going to be really hard to see on the camera, but in person I can look in there and I know it's definitely in there. And then after that is the snap ring, which is right there. Hopefully you can see that. And again, I didn't take that snap ring off, so I'm confident that everything's good there. So if we continue to follow it, number 9 would be next, which is this guy here. And he's in place, and I know he's right because I never removed this snap ring. So looking at the diagram, we have that, and then we have the snap ring. So I'm confident nothing's changed there, obviously because I didn't take any of the snap rings off. But even if you didn't, like I was explaining before, whoever was in here before lost a couple thrust washers in a couple different places. So definitely look in there and make sure your spacer's in there, your washer's in there, because just because you didn't take it apart doesn't mean that the last guy didn't and forgot something. Okay, we're continuing on working on our main shaft. So we left off at this point here where the snap ring is. And looking at here, that would be right where we left off, would be number 27. Alright, so next we need this spline washer, and you can see the order I took everything off in, and you notice something missing. So that's going to be that guy there that I had to order. Again, whoever was in here before left that out. So we're going to put that in first, and then number 12 will go in with the dog ears going this way. Then number 20 is our thrust washer. That'll go in. Then we got our spacer. That's a spline spacer. And then we have, lastly, number 6, if that'll focus, is this gear here. And you're going to notice one side is machined flat, and the other side has, I'll call it a ridge or a raised end. That raised end needs to face out this way. Ridged end this way. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put our spline washer on now in place. Pay attention to this. It does make a difference which way it goes. There's what I'll call a rounded edge or a smooth edge. And then the other side is a little more, it's more flat. The flat side of the washer needs to go to the right, needs to go this way, away from first gear. Next, we're going to put our gear in. I call them dog ears, are going to go facing this way towards first gear. Then you're going to put your thrust washer in. This also seems to have a more of a rounded side and more of a flat side, so I would stick with the flat side going in this direction. When I read the book, it doesn't specify, so I'm going to stick with the flat side going to the right as we're building this. Then we're going to slide in our splined bushing or spacer, and then our last gear. And remember that what I'm calling the raised side is going to face this way, away from first gear. Okay, so there's our main shaft all put back together. In between the mating surfaces, use a little bit of assembly lube anywhere things are going to be in contact. It helps on startup. But that's the finished product. I recommend looking at your diagram and double checking it at least twice. Maybe not have to take it apart again, but kind of visually go through and make sure that you did everything right. And that's it. We're going to move on to this guy next. And for those of you guys that are experienced that might be watching this, I'm going a little bit slow on this, so hopefully it's not boring you. But for anybody trying to do this for the first time, I'm just trying to go step by step the best I can. Okay, so I have the counter shaft taken apart and laid out so I can double check and see what I'm missing, if anything. And I happen to know I am missing stuff here once again because I had to order some stuff. So working from this end, this gear right here, this snap ring, and everything in between here I didn't undo, and I visually inspected it and everything's in there, so we're working from here. So we have this gear here, number 14, which is this guy. He's going to go on. Then we have number 22, which should be a thrust washer. We don't have, we're missing. But again, I believe I have it over there. I lost track of what I ordered. Then we have a spacer, which we have. Then we have this gear here, which we have. And then we have one more thrust washer, which we're missing. So, like I said, whoever did this before, very amateur job. But when I get done here, everything's going to be where it should be, and all the parts are going to be there. Yeah, so that's where we're at. I just got to double check my part numbers and see which washers are which here. I ordered stuff from a couple different places. So that's where we're at. So I'm going to figure out which washers go where, and then we can get this assembled, and then we can work on this side. We'll go through this. I believe I have all the parts here. In fact, I guess we'll go through that real quick. Okay, number 22, this gear, this spacer, that spline washer, and that snap ring. All those components are in here. Again, I didn't take that snap ring off, so all that's there, and I visually checked it. So after that snap ring, right there, we're going to have gear, that guy, thrust washer, which we actually have, spacer, gear, and thrust washer again, which we actually have, which is a good thing. So I have all the components for this. So I'm going to go ahead and figure out these washers, see which ones I need, and then we'll start assembling. Okay, so I believe I'm set up correctly here now. I have my gear, I have my washer, spacer, gear, washer. Notice the part numbers. This is 9452 KZ4000. This is 9453 KZ4000. Make sure you have those in the right space. They're two totally different sizes. If that'll focus, you can kind of see this one here has a little more surface area, and I'm not quite sure, but I'm assuming the diameters are different because of the way the shaft stages. So yeah, very important. Make sure you have those in the right order, because that definitely matters. Okay, so we're going to start putting this guy together now. We're going to start with this one here. Make sure that your, I'll call it your slotted area, for lack of a better term, where your shift fork's going to go into, that end has to face the splined end, which is this here. We're going to refer to that as the splined end. That's the way the book explains it. So that's going to slide in that way. Alright, next you have your thrust washer. Again, you have a flat side and a rounded side. Make sure your flat side or your sharp side is facing away from the splined end. Then you got your spacer. Then we're going to take this gear here and make sure this side is facing towards the splined end. The side's flat. This side has your indentations. That's going to go towards the splined end. Make sure it slides into your spacer. And then take your last thrust washer. Again, flat side, sharp side, facing away from the spline. Okay, so we're going to start on this side now, the spline side. And this gear here, our grooved area, again I'm going to call it where our clutch fork is going to face away from the splined end, so it's going to face this way. Make sure you put a little bit of assembly lube on there, or some transmission fluid. Alright, next you got your thrust washer, and these are new so you can really feel the flat side and the sharp side on them. Make sure the flat side, sharp side is facing towards the spline end. Next you got your spacer, and we're going to take this gear here, make sure that your indentation is facing this way, away from the spline end. That's your flat side. It's going to go the other way, obviously. So the indentation side this way. Alright, and then you got your last thrust washer. Again, find your flat, sharp side and face it towards the spline end. And that's it. Make sure until you start putting this together, you put something around each end, like I did with this guy over here, so you don't lose any parts, because it's real easy. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put our shift drum in now. I had to remove our pins so I can slide these out of the way enough to get our shift drum in there. This can only go in one way. You can see this smaller end with the pin, that goes face down. There we go. Now we're going to go ahead and set these back in place. We'll put our pins back in. You'll set these into these, I'll call them splines for lack of a better term, grooves, and they should only fall into one place, so I don't think you can screw those up. Okay, now that everything's in place, one of the main things you have to check is to make sure that the pin, I'm going to call it the pin on each fork, goes to each end of its groove. So in other words, this one right here is all the way, it's kind of hard to see, but it's all the way touching the end of its groove. So now if we rotate this, sometimes you have to spin these gears to get it to go, but now it's all the way to the extreme other end, and you can see it's bottoming out at the end of its groove there. So you got to check each one. That one right there now is all the way touching this end. So if we go ahead and rotate this drum, kind of need a third hand to do this, but you should be able to get that to go all the way to the other end. And if you look right there, it's hard to see, but it's all the way to the other extreme end. So now take your last one, which is this guy here. All right, we're right there, so this one's really tough to see, but it's all the way to this end. So we're going to rotate the drum, and now, again, very tough to see, but it's all the way to the extreme other end. So do that several times, and in other words, you got to make sure you got full travel. And sometimes when you're doing this, you might have to spin this a little bit to make sure that you get it to move properly. But again, make sure each shift fork goes from one end of the groove all the way to the other end of the groove. If not, that means you have something wrong. Okay, so our next step we're going to check is to make sure this shifts through all the gears. I have the shift drum all the way counterclockwise, so that should spin freely. You should not be able to hold this gear. If you try to hold it, it's going to spin. So spin that a little bit by hand and turn your shift drum to the right. Now you should be able to hold that gear, and shift again, and shift again. So we pretty much just went through all the gears there. And again, shouldn't be able to hold this gear when it's in any gear. The only time you should be able to do that is when it's in neutral, which is going to be right there. So now that gear won't spin. So you can't check this enough. It's really important. Obviously, if you get this wrong and you put your case back on and bolt everything up and something's wrong, you know, you're back to the drawing board. So double check, triple check, whatever your comfort level is. But now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use some lubricant, some assembly lube. You can use transmission fluid that you're going to end up putting in here for the lubricant. That's fine. You just don't want to dry start up. So I use assembly lube. It comes in a tube. It's easy to put on there, and it's you know, it's going to mix with the transmission fluid later. So, you know, lube up in between all your gears, lube up your shift drum, and basically get it ready for reassembly. All right, we're getting ready to put on our second half of the case now. We're going to use an installer tool for that. I'll show you that. Our gears are all good now, so we're going to go ahead and put our gasket on. Before we do that, I'm using a little bit of Permatex. This is a flexible sealant. It doesn't get hard. You can use this like a grease. You just want something on there that's going to hold that gasket in place. I'm using this because whoever was in here before was somewhat of an amateur, and you can see they gouged it up because they must not have had the proper tool to separate the cases, so they were trying to pry on it. So I want something to fill in those gaps because we don't want any leaks. So I'm hoping this stuff does the trick. All right, so we put some of that Permatex around here. We're going to go ahead and set our gasket in place now. Like I said, you can use, if you don't have any gouges in yours like I have mine. I mean, they're not horrible, but I wish they weren't there. But grease or this stuff will kind of hold the gasket in place for you as you're putting your second half of the case on. So get that ready like that, and then you have to snip these and trim it out a little bit better later. Okay, we're getting ready to start pulling our cases together. We have our installer tool on here. I'm not going to go over this too much in detail. Basically, you need an installer tool. It comes with directions. There's a couple different size adapters. You screw on the proper ones, and then this threads onto it. And then as you're tightening this nut, it's going to pull these cases together. Go slow at first. Make sure that it's squeezing evenly. Nothing's binding because you could very easily crack something or warp something. So just take it easy, and once you start seeing that it's pulling in equally, you know, then just keep going until everything's fully engaged. If you start to notice that it's not going perfectly even as you're tightening that, you know, it may vary a little bit, but right now I got this pretty even. But if you have a rubber or a plastic mallet, my end over here was a little bit higher than the back end, so I gave it a couple easy taps, and that pretty much leveled everything out. Okay, we're going to start putting our shift mechanism together now. Get all your pieces laid out. Make sure you have everything ready to go. Make sure you got a clean area. There's a lot of little small pieces and springs and easy to drop something. So the first thing we're going to do is set our spring in place, and you got to make sure you got it in the proper way. I guess if you had it the wrong way, you should know it shouldn't really fit right or should look awkward. But make sure your little hook is sticking up like that. Next, we're going to set our washer on there, like so. Then take your arm, that's your orientation. You have that little notch there, if that'll focus, and make sure that that notch rests in right where that hook is in that spring. Alright, then you're going to get your bolt in there and go ahead and finger tighten that. Kind of hard to do while I'm holding the camera, but this bolt on the other side's got a little bit of a shoulder on it, and it has to set into this arm, so you might have to wiggle this a little bit as you're tightening the bolt in, and then you'll feel it set into place. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and put in our selector. You're going to take that notch right there, and make sure you're lined up with the pin on the bottom of the shift drum. In order to do that, you're going to have to pull this arm back. It's under spring tension. You might need a pair of pliers or somebody to help you pull that back and hold it. It's got quite a bit of tension on it. Then once you get this in place, then you can let that arm release and it'll set up against this. Okay, next we're going to put in our bolt, I'll call it. That's going to go right in there, obviously, like that. It's going to thread in. Put some thread locker on here. Make sure you don't use the heavy duty stuff or you'll never get this out again. Use the blue stuff. That's like a medium strength. Go ahead and put that in and look in your book. I'm going to look it up. I believe it's 20 foot-pounds. And once you get this in, make sure you torque it down to the proper specs. Okay, now you got to get this guy put together. Put your springs in, your caps in, and then get the two flat pieces set. If I can get that to focus, you can. I'm holding the camera, so I have nothing to point, but make sure the indent is where you see the spring going in and out. The flat end, you can see where my finger is, and the rounded end goes inside. Now you're going to take that and you're going to place it in there this way. And very important, there's a sleeve on here. Make sure you don't drop that as you're moving it around, because it's small and you'll never find it probably. Okay, so once you get this all together, hopefully you can see that. You got to put your springs and your caps in here and try to get a better look at that. Then put these flat pieces in like so, and be careful because they're spring loaded, obviously. No, they'll go flying out. And also keep an eye on this, I'll call it a spacer right here that's on top. That actually will come off, so as you're moving this around you could drop that on the ground and you probably won't even know it. So just be careful of that. So we're going to take this guy now, and you have to slide it through here, and then everything will set into the case. Okay, so that's your orientation of the way it's going to go into the case. Again, you got your spring-loaded caps in here, so as you're trying to set this in place, be careful because it gets a little tricky. And again, with the springs and everything, you almost need a third hand. And again, also watch that guy there as you're setting this in. Once you get it right, it should pop right in there for you. Okay, so your next step, and I did this off camera, but you're going to take your shift mechanism and you're going to lube it up a little bit, the stem, and that's going to push down through your seal that's in the back. That's where your shift lever is going to go. So you just push that straight down, make sure it goes over that pin, and make sure that you're rested in where that sleeve is. And should be good to go. Now we can put our last 3 bolts in and get everything torqued down. And I will say this is probably the trickiest part that I ran into so far, getting everything in place just right and having those springs not pop out on you, which they did on me a couple times. So just be patient with it. When it falls into place, you know it's where it's supposed to.